All right. Well, I think it's a pretty good idea to have at least one subject every day be somewhat news related. Yesterday was the North Korea situation, and today I think I'm going to touch on the immigrant children situation. Now, it would be very easy to go and repeat the talking points of other channels to be like, oh, well, these are old laws. They were passed by other presidents. They are or are not ethical. It seems to be the majority is on the side that they're not ethical. What Trump wants, it's a bargaining chip, et cetera, et cetera. And I think all of those are very valid points, but you don't need to hear them from me for like a 50th time. I think instead we should take a look at the reality of the situation on the ground and ask ourselves truly, is there anything else that you would do? So, all right, you're out in the middle of the desert and you're a border security agent. You run across some migrants. There's two men and a child, right? So you arrest them and you take them to a detention facility. Now, just like any other crime, these adults have in fact committed a crime, and whether that crime is a felony or a misdemeanor, you you know you're arrested, you go to jail, you get brought up the next day to in front of a judge, where they decide if there's going to be a case against you or not, essentially. And during this process, you're going to be separated from your kids if you're an American citizen, and the thing that you're arrested for is anything really, whether it's innocuous like jaywalking or not. Like, okay, so the police are going to call your husband or wife or whatever to come get your kid if you get arrested for jaywalking, which would be pretty hard because you'd have to like resist the police and then you'd be on much more serious charges, whatever. But nonetheless, if you go to jail, whether it's a minor offense or a major offense, you are at that point separated from your kids. Even if you're a single parent, they don't go into the jail cell with you. They'll go with a social worker until you're released, even if there's no chance that they'll be permanently taken away from you. And essentially, that's what we're doing, right? And I don't have any idea how you would do this any other way. Even if you had family holding facilities, you have no guarantee, like I was saying, is that okay, so you've arrested these people, they don't have any documentation. You can't prove that this is their kid. You don't want to accidentally release the kid into the hands of somebody that isn't good for them. They haven't made responsible decisions about uprooting their entire lives to commit a crime with their children, to take them to a country where they'll be permanently a legal pariah unless the laws change in favor of amnesty. So let me ask you, what would you do in this situation if you were in charge? Some children come across the border and you have no way to verify that they're actually with their parents. They are parents who put their child's life at risk in order to uproot their stable childhood, or maybe it wasn't stable, but it wasn't as unstable as traveling across a dangerous countryside in order to illegally sneak into a foreign land where they won't be allowed to stay essentially for the rest of their entire lives. That's not a responsible decision. But even if they are their parents, if they are their parents, they're not responsible. And if they aren't their parents, then it could be child sex trafficking. They could be just sneaking the kid in to reunite them with family that had come across illegally before. But you don't know. You have no way to know, and now you have to do something with these children. So I think that it's unreasonable to expect any other outcome. And now, to get back into repeating the points from earlier, when you look at it from this perspective of like, what could you do otherwise, you see why this has been going on for so long, why it started under Clinton, why it continued under Bush, why it continued under Obama, and why it continued under Trump. So the law needs to change. And in this regard, Trump isn't wrong. Now, it is very apparent that Trump is vocalizing this position in a way that is very adversarial, like it's a bargaining chip. And maybe it is. But we've seen now 20 years, more than 20 years, of this going on without any relief in sight. I think at this point it is time to leverage politicians into changing the system. So, what should the output be? What should the change be, in my opinion? Well, I think the most important thing is culture. And I think defending the culture of your nation, when the culture is centered around the rights that you have ascribed as the principal matter in which your government is involved is the most important thing. So, immigrants who want to integrate, who want to learn the language, who want to be part of the American system, I think those are the immigrants that should be able to stay. And so there needs to be a way to separate those who do from those who don't. Now, that being said, you could argue that those who do are the ones that are applying to come across legally, and those who don't are the ones who are sneaking across the border. But it's been no secret for a long time that immigrating to the United States and getting on the wait list and being approved is a very lengthy, time-consuming, and expensive process. And unfortunately, I don't think there's any way that you can truthfully separate that from the current situation, where absolutely a lot of these illegal immigrants are coming across illegally because they aren't really left with any other reasonable option. But that doesn't mean that we're wrong for defending our rights. As we've seen with this, the Arab replacement of people essentially in Europe, that there's only so many immigrants you can take in without fundamentally changing your country. And now I don't think like burritos in the Spanish language are the biggest threats to American sovereignty, but you do have to consider that if they don't want to integrate and they're going to spend their time and efforts in the economy only to send money out of the country, and there is a large illegal population that is having an impact on the maintenance of roads, hospitals, and schools, that you have to do something. And so I think that deportation of illegal immigrants is something that does need to continue. But we can extend amnesty, I think, to groups that have really not been more than a victim. So when it does come to children and teenagers who are brought over when they weren't adults, I think that they should be the first candidates for amnesty, because they're the most likely to integrate. They didn't have a choice in coming here. They're a victim of their parents' choices, and that they're the ones that fall most soundly in the gray area. And yes, some of them are gang members. Some of them have fallen by the wayside. Some of them are not really interested in integration, but I think a lot of them are. And if that's what it takes to get reform, where it's easier to verify those willing to integrate and allow them to come here, and it's easier to secure the border because we expand our border defense system, then whether that's a wall or it's more agents or whatever, or it's just better policies that discourage illegal immigration, whatever that means, I think that that's an acceptable change to make. An acceptable concession to say, okay, well, these kids, these victims, they have first shot at amnesty. Now, in terms of reuniting families, it's difficult, and I'm not really sure what we can do at this point beyond what we're already doing. I mean, they don't have paperwork. We don't have access to their own country's paperwork. Some of the places that they're coming from don't even track these sorts of things, so it's very difficult. I would think that at this point of crisis, at this point of refugees, I shouldn't say refugees. That's the trouble we get into, is that we look at them as refugees, and to some extent they are economic refugees, but they're not refugees from war. I mean, other than maybe Venezuela, these aren't war-torn Middle Eastern countries where people are blowing themselves up in the streets. They're just not as economically viable as the United States, and the cost of living there is so low that you can send someone to the United States to work, and even if they're working under the table for like minimum wage or less, and they're only sending a portion of that money back home, it's significantly more than they could make back home in some of these countries. This is why they come here. Yeah, there's a few of them, particularly in the north of Mexico, that are avoiding or fleeing from these drug cartels, but for the most part, it's economically based. It's not under threat of violence. So I think what our government needs to do, in addition to securing the border, in addition to making it easier to immigrate legally, as long as you're willing to integrate, and potentially extending amnesty to these kids, is we need to lean harder on these South American countries that are creating these economic crises in which these people are being so heavily disparaged in their lives that they think that the only solution is to run to the United States. We should be pressuring the Mexican government that if you don't clean up the cartels, we're going to clean them up for you. Because it's one thing that the cartels exist and they're a Mexican problem, but when they get as bad as they are, that they become an American problem, then I think it's beyond our reason to argue that it's our right to then go in and clean up the problem. Like, your mess is costing American lives. Your mess is creating an immigration crisis in the United States. It's draining our government. It's draining our economy. And even if it's not to such a significant extent that it's causing some sort of recession, because I don't think any of the recession really came down to immigrants, but it is, costing taxpayers millions, if not billions of dollars, then it is justified, I think, that we go in and we clean this mess up. And really, Mexico has as much to gain as we do. Maybe the politicians in power now are corrupt and they have more to gain from the cartels, but the whole of the Mexican people, they have more to gain from us cleaning up this mess than anybody. And I think it would be okay for us to start pursuing that first diplomatically and then maybe not so diplomatically afterwards if Mexico is unwilling to cooperate.